If you've made it this far, you're exactly who we make these videos for. Subscribe and help us hit 1,000. A country on the Nile has spent more than 1,000 years telling the world exactly what it is. Its constitution says it, its school books say it. Its oldest families keep handwritten genealogies that say it, passed down father to son for generations. This is a founding member of the Arab League. Arabic is its official language, spoken in its parliament, its courts, its mosques. Its most prominent tribal confederations, the Ja'aliyin, the Juhayna, trace their bloodlines back to the Arabian Peninsula itself, some claiming descent from the Prophet Muhammad's own uncle, others from the tribe of Quraysh. For centuries, no one seriously questioned this. Then geneticists opened up the genome. What they found did not match the paperwork. The dominant ancestry signal running through these same self-identified Arab families was not Arabian at all. It was old. It was local. It traced back to the Nile Valley itself, to populations that were living and farming and burying their dead along this river 1,000 years before the word Arab meant anything here. In some of the most fiercely Arab-identified groups in the country, the actual genetic contribution from the Arabian Peninsula sits in the single digits. This is not a footnote. This is a country that fought civil wars, in Darfur and elsewhere, partly along a line between Arab and African, a line the DNA does not draw where the map says it should. Two major studies sit behind this story: a 2017 genome-wide analysis out of Uppsala University, and a 2021 ancient DNA excavation tied to Harvard's Reich Lab. Both will matter. Both are coming. But first, the question this whole story turns on: if the genes don't back up the genealogy, then who have Sudan's Arab families actually been for the last 1,000 years? Rewind. Long before any of this, before Arabic was spoken on the Nile at all, this land belonged to Nubia. Kerma rose first, a Bronze Age kingdom flourishing between roughly 2500 and 1500 BCE, trading gold and ivory with Egypt to the north. Then came Napata, then Meroe, a literate, pyramid-building civilization that dominated the Middle Nile from roughly 800 BCE until its collapse around 350 CE. These were not fringe settlements. Meroe had its own script, its own royal dynasties, its own iron industry. It was, for 1,000 years, one of Africa's great river civilizations. After Meroe fell, Christian Nubian kingdoms took its place: Nobatia, Makuria, and Alodia, stretching from roughly the 6th century into the 14th or 15th. These kingdoms built cathedrals, exchanged bishops with Byzantium, and held their ground against a new force pressing in from the north: Islam, spreading south from Arabia through Egypt from the 7th century onward. In 652 CE, Arab Egypt and Christian Makuria signed the Pact, a treaty that is easy to underestimate. It didn't produce a conquest, it produced something slower. Centuries of trade, intermarriage, and gradual settlement, Arabian merchants and migrants moving into Nubian towns not as an invading army, but as neighbors, husbands, and eventually, patriarchs. Out of that slow contact came the Nasab, the genealogical tradition, claimed today by confederations like the Ja'aliyin and Juhayna, tracing unbroken male lines back to Arabian tribes. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the Christian Nubian kingdoms were gone, replaced by Islamic sultanates. The Funj Sultanate, founded around 1504, chief among them, Arabic spread. Islamic identity spread. And when the modern state won its independence in 1956, it did so as a self-declared Arab nation, joining the Arab League that same year, building a national identity in which Arab and African were treated as opposite categories. Categories that would go on to determine land rights, tribal status, and access to power for the next 7 decades. This is the story every schoolbook tells. It is coherent, it is documented, it has one detail that does not fit. Here is where it gets complicated. When geneticists finally sat down with the DNA, not the genealogies, the actual chromosomes, the Arabian lineages that were supposed to be everywhere in this Arab nation turned out to be almost nowhere. The clearest picture comes from Nina Hallfelder and her colleagues at Uppsala University, who in 2017 published a genome-wide study in PLOS Genetics, examining populations across Sudan and Northeast Africa. Think of a genome as a long, layered rope, braided from strands contributed by every ancestral population a person descends from, and Hallfelder's team could trace which strands came from where. What they found: Sudanese populations, including groups that identify culturally as Arab down to the last generation, cluster genetically far closer to other Northeast and East African populations Nilo-Saharan and Cushitic-speaking groups, than to anyone from the Arabian Peninsula. The anomaly sits in the numbers. Researchers estimate that Eurasian-related, meaning broadly Arabian-related, ancestry in several Arabic-identified Sudanese groups clusters somewhere in a modest band, commonly cited between roughly 10 and 35%, depending on the specific group and region. The majority of the genome, in every case, remains indigenous Northeast African. This is not a rounding error. This is the bulk of a family's genetic inheritance sitting in direct contradiction to the family's genealogical claim. Exact figures per specific tribal group, Jaliin, Shaigia, Danagla, still require careful confirmation against the original data, and researchers are careful to frame these estimates as probability ranges, not fixed certainties. The second anchor goes further back, and it comes from bone, not blood. Kendra Sirac, working with Harvard Medical School's Reich Lab, published ancient DNA results in 2021 from the Kulubnarti site, a pair of Nubian cemeteries dated to the Christian period, roughly 700 to 1400 CE. The cemeteries were socially stratified. One held higher status burials, one held lower status burials. If ancestry tracked status the way later Arab genealogies would insist bloodline track status, the two cemeteries should look genetically distinct. They don't. No meaningful genetic differentiation between the two groups. Status, in this Nubian society, was not running along ancestral lines. And here is the twist inside the twist. The Kulubnarti skeletons, buried centuries before any large-scale Arabization of the Nile, already carried a mixed ancestry profile. A real, measurable Eurasian-related component was present in this population 1,000 years before the story says it should have arrived. Which means the tidy version, purely indigenous Nubians, later invaded and genetically diluted by Arab newcomers, was already wrong in both directions before Islam ever entered the picture. The Nile Valley was not a sealed African population waiting to be Arabized. It was layered, mixed, and moving long before anyone here called himself an Arab. Not by centuries. By 1,000 years, at least. So if the ancient Nile Valley was already mixed before Islam arrived, and the modern Arab groups are mostly indigenous after Islam settled in, where did the Arab genealogies actually come from? The first theory researchers reach for is the simplest one: assimilation without replacement. Names, language, and religion travel faster than genes ever do. It would only take a small number of actual Arabian migrant men marrying into a much larger local population to seed an entire tribal identity that their descendants would carry forward for 1,000 years. Even as those descendants were born, generation after generation, overwhelmingly to local Nubian and Cushitic mothers. The mechanism is built into the genealogical system itself. Nasab traces only the father's line. It has no mechanism for counting mothers at all. A single founding father, real or claimed, is enough to launch an Arab tribal identity that outlives him by 40 generations, regardless of who his descendants' mothers were. This pattern isn't unique to Sudan. Similar dynamics, a small number of claimed Arab founders, a genealogy that outran the actual gene flow, have been proposed elsewhere across Islamic-era populations, including in parts of North Africa and along the Swahili coast, where Arab-claimed lineages likewise show far more local ancestry than their family trees admit. The specific comparative citations for those parallels still need confirming before they're presented as settled fact. Inside the Hallfelder dataset itself, the mismatch is stark. Some populations claiming strong, unbroken Arab descent carry Eurasian-related ancestry estimates sitting well under half of their total genome. Genealogy claims near total descent. The genome shows something closer to a minority strand, folded into a much larger indigenous majority. It's a tidy explanation. It has a problem. It doesn't explain the regions where the numbers don't behave. Some northern riverine groups show meaningfully higher Eurasian-related ancestry than their neighbors do. Not negligible, not a rounding error, but a real and uneven signal moving across the map. If genealogical grafting were the whole story, gene flow should look roughly flat everywhere the claim exists. It doesn't. Somewhere, real Arabian ancestry actually did move into this population in measurable amounts. Just not evenly, and not always where the loudest genealogical claims sit today. Genealogical grafting explains why the story spread faster than the genes did. It does not explain why some Sudanese groups really do carry a heavier Eurasian signature than others. There's a second, more complicated explanation for that gap, and it reaches back further than Islam ever did. It reaches back to the Bronze Age, and to a body of water most people think of as a barrier rather than a bridge. The second theory says the Eurasian signal in Sudanese genomes was never a single event at all. It isn't one wave, arriving with Arab migrants in the 7th century and then sitting still for 1400 years. It's layers, stacked on top of each other like sediment in a riverbed, each one deposited by a different contact event, centuries or millennia apart. Hallfelder and her Uppsala team said as much directly in their 2017 findings. They modeled Sudanese populations as shaped by what they called the continuity of indigenous groups alongside Eurasian migrations, plural. Not a migration, migrations. More than one door, opened at more than one time. Look at the Beja, the Red Sea Hills population living along Sudan's eastern coast. Their genomes carry an older layer of Eurasian-related ancestry, one tied to Cushitic and South Arabian contact that predates Islam entirely, distinct from the later, medieval-era Arab migrations their inland neighbors' genealogies claim credit for. The Red Sea, it turns out, was never the wall it looks like on a map. For at least 3,000 to 4,000 years, it functioned as a corridor, merchants, goods, and people moving back and forth between the ancient kingdom of Kush and trading partners across the water, centuries before anyone on either shore had heard of the Prophet Muhammad or his tribe. The dating on the earliest of that contact is still being refined. But the direction of the evidence is not in serious dispute. And here is where Theory 1 starts to come apart. If some of this Eurasian ancestry arrived 1,000 years before Islam did, then the story Sudan tells about it, that this bloodline came from Arabian migrants who intermarried with local families after the 7th century, isn't just incomplete. In places, it's misattributed, ancestry that actually arrived via ancient Red Sea trade, with no connection to any Arabian tribe or Islamic migration whatsoever, appears to have been folded retroactively into a genealogy built centuries later, credited to the wrong migration, the wrong century, the wrong tribe. The family story says, our fathers came from Arabia in the age of the prophet. The genome may be saying something closer to, some of this was already here, long before there was an Arabia to come from, in the sense the story means it. Researchers are candid about the limits here, distinguishing an ancient Red Sea layer from a medieval Arab-Islamic layer, at the level of raw DNA, is genuinely difficult with the sample sizes and reference populations currently available. The signals sit close together. They can be seen. They cannot yet be cleanly separated and stamped with a date. Which brings the story to the theory most researchers are far more hesitant to say out loud. The third theory doesn't ask what percentage of the ancestry is real. It asks whether ancestry was ever really the point. Because there's a version of this story where Arab in Sudan was never primarily a bloodline claim at all, where it functioned, first and foremost, as a status category, a label worth adopting strategically by families and clans seeking tax exemptions, land grants, or access to power under 1,000 years of shifting rule. The Funj Sultanate, the Ottoman Egyptian administration known as the Turkiya, and finally the British colonial government, which formally sorted Sudan's population into administrative categories. Arab on one side of the ledger, African, in the era's own blunt language, on the other. Categories built for a census form. Categories that outlived the census and hardened into the political fault lines Sudan still lives with today, long after whatever genetic basis they once had, if they ever had one, had worn down to almost nothing. Follow that thread in the modern Arab versus African framing, the one that helped justify land seizures and violence in Darfur and beyond, starts to look less like a description of two different peoples and more like the fossil of an old tax bracket. That is not something ancient DNA can prove. It's not something a genome study can disprove either. It sits in the historical record as an interpretation. A plausible one, but an interpretation all the same, not a finding stamped and closed. Picture the ground this argument is actually standing on. Imagine standing on the riverbank at Kulubnardi, on a narrow shelf of farmland squeezed between sandstone cliffs and the Nile, near the third cataract in what is now northern Sudan. The heat comes off the rock in waves. Below, the river runs loud over the cataract's rapids, the only sound for miles besides wind. This is one of the harshest, most beautiful stretches of the whole Nile Valley, a strip of green so thin you could walk across it in 10 minutes, desert pressing in on both sides. Two cemeteries sit close together here, dated to the Christian period, roughly the 7th through the 14th centuries. One holds the burials of the community's higher status dead. One holds the lower status dead. This is the exact population Kendra Sirach's team sampled for ancient DNA, the same population that showed no meaningful genetic split between the two groups, whatever social distance separated them in life. Beneath this ground, generations were born, married, farmed, and buried, centuries before any Arab genealogy existed to make a claim on them. centuries before anyone standing here had ever used the word Sudan, and the river hasn't stopped. It runs past these same cliffs today, past descendants who now call themselves Arab, or Nubian, or Beja, or something harder to sort into any single box. Labels their ancestors at Kulubnarti never used, and, as far as the evidence shows, never needed. Which is where all of this finally converges. Sudan's Arab identity is not evidence of Arabian descent. It is also not simply fiction. It is something harder to put in either box. A genuine, centuries-deep identity that absorbed a real, if modest, amount of Eurasian ancestry, some of it ancient and some of it medieval, and then wrapped that modest genetic thread in a genealogical narrative many times larger than the genes underneath it can support. That has consequences that reach well past a family tree. The Arab versus African binary that has shaped Sudanese politics, citizenship, and war for more than a century rests on a distinction the genome does not cleanly draw. At the level of the genome itself, most self-identified Arab Sudanese and most self-identified African Sudanese sit closer to each other than either group sits to anyone from the Arabian Peninsula. The ancient mixture already present at Kulubnarti, centuries before Islam, the genealogical grafting of a handful of claimed fathers, spreading a tribal identity across thousands of descendants who share almost none of his ancestry. The older, pre-Islamic Red Sea contact, mistakenly credited to a 7th century migration it has nothing to do with. 3 separate threads. 1 rope, and the rope was never as cleanly split as the map of this country's wars has always insisted it was. Not a resolved case, an enlarged one, because genetics can show, with real confidence, that this population was never as divided as its identity categories claim. What it cannot do is tell you which specific families, if any, carry the real Arabian descent their genealogies insist on. It cannot settle the political and territorial claims that were built, generation after generation, on top of that insistence. A researcher working through the Hallfelder data once put it to a colleague more plainly than any paper would allow. The DNA doesn't take sides in Darfur. It just makes clear that the side-taking was never really about ancestry to begin with. Sudan is not alone in this. It is one of dozens of places on Earth where a political or religious identity, Arab, Aryan, Hutu, and Tutsi, caste lines drawn and redrawn across South Asia, was treated as a bloodline when it functioned, underneath, as a status system. And in almost every one of those places, genetics has arrived decades or centuries too late to stop the identity from hardening into policy, into war, into who owns the land and who doesn't. That is the uncomfortable durability of a story built on genealogy rather than genome. It does not require genetic proof to survive. It survives contact with the evidence. It has been surviving it for years already. Millions of people, across generations, built family status, land claims, and a private sense of who they are on a genealogical story their own genome only partly agrees with. And no swab, no lab result, no published paper is going to unwind that overnight, or perhaps ever. Think of the Nile itself, still running past Kulubnarti's twin cemeteries, still carrying the same water it carried when the first Nubian farmers buried their dead there, indifferent to which name the people on its banks have called themselves in any given century. The river never split into an Arab channel and an African channel. It only ever ran one way. The people did the dividing themselves. The Sudanese were never who they thought they were, and the DNA has only just begun to reveal the truth. It has not finished, and it may never be allowed to.